Welcome back to The Big Picture. Back in 2013, Alabama was one of a group of red states that rushed to block the vote after the Supreme Court struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. Like other Republican-controlled states like North Carolina, Texas, and Mississippi, it put into place a strict new voter ID law that would supposedly prevent voter fraud. Since voter fraud doesn't actually exist, this law was really just a thinly veiled attempt to keep away from the polls black people, poor people, old people, college students, and anyone else who might lack an ID and might vote Democratic. But now, 2 years after that law was passed, it could soon get even harder to vote in Alabama. That's because as part of its push to find a solution to their budget woes, Alabama is considering closing down most of their DMV facilities, a place where voters can apply and get their voter IDs. In a state where around 250,000 people lack the proper kind of ID, this is a big, big deal. Joining me now to talk more about it, as well as the broader fight for voting rights, is Katherine Culliton-González, Senior Attorney and Director of Voter Protection at the Advancement Project. Katherine, welcome back.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Tom.
It's great to have you with us. And
Thank you.
We've got two Advancement Project people here tonight, too. So even though everyone knows that the voter ID laws were, kind of always about suppressing the vote, the talking points of the Republicans is that we're going to help you get IDs. Don't worry, everything's going to be fine. What's going on here?
Well, Alabama is a good example of that. So if the DMVs are closed, there would only be 4 DMVs in the whole state, in the big cities. And so anybody who doesn't live in the big city would have to find a way to get there from a few hours away. And Alabama also has said that you can get a free voter ID if you don't have a driver's license. But we know that in 2014, people were actually disenfranchised because they didn't have access to the driver's license and they didn't have access to these free IDs. So I remember the case of 93-year-old Willie Mims, and he showed up to vote, and he's an African-American who's voted his entire life. He's 93, he no longer drives, so he doesn't have a driver's license, and he was unable to vote. And that happened to, actually a few hundred people in 2014. So the access to the free IDs, isn't so easy. We've seen that across the country and in the states where we've litigated. And we're starting to see that a lot more in the South now because of the Supreme Court's decision to not have federal protection over voting there.
It would be particularly difficult for disabled people, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Or, for persons with disabilities and anybody with any kind of limitation. So that's why we see, more elderly folks and people with language access issues and persons with all kinds of, physical disabilities, really unable to make the trips, to get this free ID. That's supposedly being offered. And that's why the numbers are so high. So among eligible voters in Alabama, 500,000 eligible voters on the voting rolls don't have the strict ID that's needed and are going to have to get one of these free IDs that are pretty hard to find out about it, go to the registrar's office or go to the Secretary of State and, show some documents or make an oath that they need an ID and then wait for it to come in the mail.
Wow. Joe Madison says Jim Crow didn't go away. He's just now changed his name. It's James Crow, ESQ.
Exactly.
Knocking 500,000 people off the voting rolls in one state in Alabama, that's breathtaking. This is a nationwide effort, isn't it, on the part of the Republicans?
Well, the states that have enacted and are continuing to propose voter suppression laws have, almost uniformly been controlled by Republican legislatures. And I always, we're nonpartisan, and certainly the Democratic Party is also sometimes guilty of voter suppression. I've litigated against Democratic Party officials. But if you look at the Republican Party platform, their platform is in favor of strict voter ID, in favor of having to have documentary proof of citizenship, and all kinds of allegations of voter fraud, and nothing about providing access to the vote. Instead, and phantom voter fraud, as you say, it's not real voter fraud. So that's the party's platform, is to make it harder for people to vote.
And one of the epicenters of this, let's build a list of people that we want to knock off the voting rolls, is Kris Kobach, the Secretary of State in Kansas.
That's right.
Tell us about him and what he's up to.
So Kris Kobach is a person who's been very active in anti-immigrant legislation across the country, and since then he expanded his repertoire to work in voting rights. But he, was behind some of the anti-immigrant laws and the model laws that were pushed out in Arizona and Alabama and other places. Since he became Secretary of State of Kansas, he's also pushed out model laws that allege that there's non-citizens on the voting rolls, or model programs to get alleged non-citizens off the voting rolls. So you may remember we litigated this in Florida, and we were able to stop a purge of alleged non-citizens. And the state first said there are hundreds of thousands of non-citizens on the voting rolls, then 1,800, then, and we saw the list, it was over 80% people of color, most Latinos, and they turned out to be naturalized citizens. They're people who, basically, some of their record shows that they came here as an immigrant and later became citizens, and the records were incorrect.
So ultimately the number was 0.
Ultimately, one Canadian citizen actually voted in Florida. And so, Mr. Kobach is instituting a program of dual registration and dual citizenship. He tried to change federal law so that the federal voter registration form would require documentary proof of citizenship. So not a regular ID. Bring in your papers, your naturalization papers, which, by the way, cost $345 to replace, or will knock you off the rolls. And so there are 30,000 people in that category now in Kansas. And, lots of complex litigation. But the main thing is it would create, basically 2 tiers of people, 2 tiers of voters. Most voters of color are going to fall into the category of people who don't have easy access to these documents and wouldn't be able to vote in state elections, only federal elections.
Now, Pennsylvania is going in a different direction. Tell me about that.
Yeah, Pennsylvania very recently announced that they have a new online voter registration program, which is great. It's fabulous news. So Secretary of State Pedro Cortez initiated it, and so kudos to him and his team. And basically what it does is make registration more convenient. Our country is probably the most inconvenient voting system in the world. So you can register online anytime that you have access to internet. You can register to vote in Pennsylvania. And, there's pretty low participation rates among various groups in Pennsylvania, and we hope that this may help. So the form is available bilingually in Spanish also, and so we hope it might, improve access for Latino voters and for 1 million African-American voters who've only registered at a rate of 49% in Pennsylvania. So this is a way to make it more convenient. So if you move frequently, or you are new to the state, or you basically need to update your registration anyway. If you're a woman who gets married and hyphenates her last name and you want to update, you could do it online instead of having to make a trip to the registrar's office, or possibly be unable to vote.
Right. Yeah. It's a step. It's a step. It's a good one. Katherine Culliton-González, thank you. Let's open this discussion up to our progressive roundtable. Still with us are Ari Rabin-Havt, Newkirk, and Erik Altieri. And curious thoughts on this?
Kris Kobach, you hear that name and it should send chills down your spine. This is the guy who wrote SB 1070 in Arizona. Like the horrific anti-immigrant bill. Like, this is a guy who has made it his mission inside the Republican Party to remove rights from people. And it's pretty amazing that you do have one party in this country that has dedicated themselves to removing rights from immigrants, removing rights from minorities, removing the right to vote, etc.
Yeah. And at the same time, that same party is fighting as hard as they can to make sure that a lot of very, very wealthy people can pour as much money as they want into the elections. So.
Absolutely. And it's really a tragedy that Americans aren't more outraged by this, because it's very clear what the overwhelming amount of these laws are trying to do. They're trying to stop people of color from voting. Why would you want to do that? Because people of color overwhelmingly vote Democrat.
Or poor people, or young people,
or elderly
people.
The young, we're missing. They're excluding very key bases simply because they know they can't win them, and they'd rather rig the game in their favor. And these are the same kind of people putting these laws into place that look back on the 3/5 compromise and Jim Crow as the good old days. These are overtly racist laws, and America needs to get angry and start to demand that they be reversed and never happen again.
Yeah. I think we need to be clear that this talk about voter fraud is a complete illusion. It's a complete ruse. I thought, the article was really good in pointing out that the research they did in this case showed that 0.0003% was the cases that they actually found in these voter registrations where somebody had done something wrong or was
Katherine,
fraudulent.
At what point do we stop talking about voter fraud and start talking about election fraud? Because it seems to me that, you know, what Jeb Bush and Katherine Harris did in 2000, knocking 60, 70, 80,000, who knows how many, it's still being litigated, I believe, people off the election rolls in Florida so that Jeb's brother George could steal the election. And that's, you know, one of many, many examples. It seems to me that that's actually election fraud. Why is there no conversation about it using that kind of terminology? Is it that the Democrats are more bashful than Republicans to use inflammatory rhetoric?
I'm not really sure why. I think it actually is a form of voter fraud to manipulate the voting rules so that you can win office. You know, that's politicians manipulating the voting rules.
If not voting fraud.
Yes, exactly. And I think the real fraud is being pulled on the American people. And, you know, no matter, you know, which party you're with or how you're going to vote, you know, the basic concept of our democracy is we're all supposed to be equal in the ballot box. It doesn't matter if you're, you know, what your race is or if you're young or you're old or you're rich or you're poor. And so we've also, in some of our cases, argued, and our experts have shown that, you know, these strict voter ID laws and talking about voter fraud that doesn't exist actually decreases confidence in the election system. You know, right. So it's actually, you know, a fact that we don't have more confidence in the election system at all because of these measures that are designed to combat phantom voter fraud. And I agree, the real voter fraud is just, you know, trying to steal an election and manipulating the rules.
Yeah. And that lack of confidence that people have. This was one of the big issues that John Paul Stevens, I believe, in his dissent to Citizens United wrote about. He said, you know, one of the most corrosive effects that enormous amounts of money in elections will have is that people just say, you know, the game is rigged. Why should I even show up?
What amazes me is the pathological nature of the voter fraud lie. I've had the opportunity on a few occasions to speak with Hans von Spakovsky, who's the kind of central guy in the voter fraud myth, who was, by the way, part of the Brooks Brothers riot in Florida during the 2000 recount. And what amazes me is how he literally just has no conception of truth. Like, he will make stuff up all the time with no hesitation at all. This is voter fraud. And then you look and no, it's not. Oh, this election was won by voter fraud. You look at the numbers. No, it's not. Like, it's just a constant stream of lies from him, and it's unbelievable. He still gets to go on the media and tell those lies.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. You're pushing back on this. There's a number of groups that are pushing back. But how long is it going to take for us to wake folks up, do you think?
I think it's bound to happen sooner or later, right? So people are waking up and smelling the coffee. You know, Advancement Project is pushing back by calling for a fundamental, specific constitutional right to vote. That's not clear in our Constitution, and that was, you know, part of the essence of the Bush v. Gore decision that we're all talking about. We believe there should be a fundamental right to vote. That's specific. That's accessible. So just same as free speech, same as all these other rights. Right. And some states are starting to embrace that concept and use the fundamental right to vote in their constitutions. That's what we use to strike down voter ID in Pennsylvania, in fact.
We could say, you'll take my ballot out of my cold, dead hand. Yeah, great to see you.
Great to see you, too. Thank you.
More on tonight's Progressive Roundtable right after the break.